Chapter 10. In the end, Jake was glad she kicked him out. He'd felt uncomfortable with how easy staying would have been. He'd even been thinking about it before she'd finished redressing, thinking about maybe picking her up and just carrying her to her bed, curling around her and burying his face in her hair to sleep. That wasn't like him. None of this was like him. He very rarely fucked a woman twice and never a human woman. What was the point? But Amanda surprised him. She kept surprising him. He wanted to find new ways to make her gasp and moan, wanted to plunder her depths for more treasures, bring her to climax over and over again, to see her body flush and cool and burn again. Even more, he had told her the truth. He'd told her almost everything, and she hadn't screamed, hadn't run. He knew she hadn't really processed it all yet, though. He purposely hadn't given her time. Maybe tomorrow there would be screaming and running. But tonight there had been pleasure and acceptance, and he was unused to both of those things coming from one source. He realized with some dismay that he didn't want her to scream and run. He didn't mind it when she shouted at him. He liked a woman with some fire to her. He didn't mind it when she tried to tell him what to do even. He was okay with it if she got pissed at him. But he didn't want her to fear him. He didn't want to see terror in her eyes when she looked at him. He didn't know how to stop it from happening, though. He was what he was, and most people found that terrifying, or they would if normal people knew. She was the first human he'd ever told. This was completely unknown territory for him, and he was pretty sure he was going to fuck it all up, because that's what he usually did. He took himself back to the forest, careful to avoid the pack's marked territory, and let the wolf take over. Maybe if he could run off some of the anxiety during the night, he'd wake up in the morning with an idea of how to keep Amanda safe and sane, and his for the taking, while finally solving these murders. Chapter 11. Amanda slept fitfully after Jake left. She hated to admit it, but she was still turned on, even after their tryst in the kitchen, and she couldn't stop thinking about him, about what he'd told her and what he was, what he could do. Was it real? It had to have been real. She'd seen it. That was the trouble with madness, wasn't it? Sometimes you couldn't trust even your own eyes. But Amanda had also felt something wild both times they'd had sex. She'd felt that wildness in him brim towards the surface. She believed him. He was a shifter, part wolf. There were more in the world like him, and they were being murdered. When at last she did sleep, her dreams were crowded with monsters, wolves and other shadowy figures with no real shape but lots of sharp teeth. Faceless killers with knives for skinning, and their gaping, skinless victims crawling towards her, reaching for her, begging her to avenge them, or at least to give them peace. She'd never felt that kind of responsibility before. Her dreams held no answers at all, just questions. She woke in the morning feeling exhausted and raw, and dragged herself into the shower, where her empty, still sleeping mind came awake with more questions and more thoughts of Jake. She felt incapable of having actual thoughts that did not turn back to him eventually. She told herself it was just because it was all so fucking bizarre that she couldn't dwell on any of the weird Jake shit. She had to focus on the case. The case was the only thing she could do anything about. She could solve the murders, and that was what she had to do, all she could let herself think about. She knew she'd have to put up with Jake while she did it, but she resolved not to sleep with him again, not to try to understand what he was, or who he was, or what that world might look like. He was just her partner, and just for this case he would just leave again the minute it was solved. She'd solve it, get rid of him, and never think about any of it ever again. That was easier said than done, of course. She got dressed and got on her bike, heading to the station while dawn was still purpling the sky above the eastern highway. It was more or less deserted at that hour. Only the night rotation was there, which consisted of Andy Rottler and Elaine's sister Donna on dispatch. Andy was asleep in the locker room. Donna yawned and waved to Amanda as she brushed through security, winding between the desks to get to her own. She set down her helmet and went to get a cup of shitty coffee to sip while she looked back through all the evidence they'd taken at the two crime scenes. She'd get Jake to give her his tablet when he got in, and she'd go through all of it again. There had to be something they were missing. With her steaming mug of absolutely awful, sludgy coffee cooling by her elbow, Amanda settled at her desk and pulled up the evidence files on her computer, filled with reports and the write-ups that had been uploaded the day before. She read through all the reports and then on her third cup of terrible coffee, she determined that she couldn't avoid looking at the crime scene photos any longer. She pulled them up and started clicking slowly through them. They were hard to look at. The actual bodies themselves had been hard enough to look at, but the pictures up close were even more gruesome. Amanda wondered if Jake had seen so many of these pictures that he was just numb to it all. She hoped that she never got to that point. She wanted images like these to always jolt her, to always make her want to look away, but now she made herself look and look closely. At first she was disgusted by how precise the cuts looked, how cleanly the knife cut through flesh to separate it from skin. Almost surgical in its neatness. Except, no, she sat up a little, looking more closely at the pictures, and then she switched over to read the ME's reports. How did we miss this? Miss what? She looked up from the computer screen. More time had passed than she'd realized. Sunlight was pouring in through the station windows, bright from the mid-morning sky. Jake was standing in front of her desk, looking down at her. She had no idea how long he might have been standing there. At least he was dressed this time. He looked less wild, which was at once disappointing and a relief. He was showered, dressed, his dark hair combed back from his face, leaning against her desk like a normal human being. She sat back in her chair before pointing at the computer screen. The way they skinned the bodies, she said quietly. It looks, it's the way a hunter skins for pelts, you know, to sell the furs. Jake frowned and came around the desk, stooping down to look at the images as, well, how can you tell? Amanda arched her eyebrows at him. I live in a small mountain town full of hunters. I know a pelt slice when I see one. So does your me, but it's not in the report. She shrugged. Maybe he just, who'd really expect to see that on a person? Jake leaned back, nodding. So, we're looking for hunters. We basically already knew that they were hunting. He cleared his throat. People like me. Yes, but this changes things. Amanda got up from her desk and grabbed her bike helmet. We knew they were hunting, not that they were actual hunters. This gives me a place to look. She started around the desk and towards the station's doors. Jake frowned and followed after her. You mean us? I'm your partner. Wherever you're going, I'm coming with you. She was already shaking her head. No way. This is not your kind of scene. What the fuck is that supposed to mean? He snapped. Where are you even going? When they got through the front doors of the station, Amanda finally turned to look at Jake. There are a few groups, she said. Just mountain men, you know? They hunt illegally all year round. We do our best to stop it, but it's hard to police it, especially since they're careful and people rarely get hurt. But I figure if this is going on, they might know about it. Somebody might know about it. So I'm going to go ask them, and I really think you shouldn't come with me because you're not going to like these people. I don't really like most people. He glared at her. And I don't appreciate you trying to strong-arm me off my own fucking investigation. I'm going with you. I won't lose my temper. I don't believe you. I don't really care if you believe me or not. I'm going with you. Now get in the Jeep. Amanda felt a flush of frustration and anger creep up her throat. She looked at the Jeep, then over at her bike, and thought about just leaving and letting him be all pissed about it. He'd probably try to follow her, or worse, tell Captain Martin, and then she'd get in trouble. Then she'd have Martin pissed at her and she'd still have to put up with Jake. So with a grumbled son of a bitch, she stowed her helmet on her bike and went over to his Jeep. But she stopped and turned to him again and held out her hand. I'm driving, she said firmly. She saw Jake visibly balk at that, but after a moment he pulled the keys from his jacket pocket and slapped them down into her palm, then walked calmly to the passenger's side door. Amanda climbed into the driver's side and yanked the door shut, turning the car on as Jake settled into his seat. There were a few blessed moments of silence once they were driving. She pulled onto the highway, though Jake sighed loudly. Where are we going? There's a bar. She glanced at his profile, then looked back at the road. The same bar I found you at before? No. It's kind of a boys' club. All the hunters in town hang out there, but nobody else really wants to because it's covered in trophies and the beer is crap. But you think these people will talk to you? Look, hunting is a common pastime here and they love it. And not all of them are fuckheads. If someone is threatening the, creed of their favorite hobby, they'll want to put a stop to it before it ruins it for all of them. Jake nodded. Fine. But if you go in there all pissed off and alpha male, they're going to shut you out. I'll follow your lead then, princess. Fuck off. She didn't look away from the road, but she just knew his expression was smug. Amanda had thought she understood why sleeping with someone you had to work with was a bad idea, but now it became exceptionally clear to her why that cliché existed. This was fucking unbearable. Or maybe it was just Jake. But there were more important things she kept reminding herself. There were people dying and she was going to stop it, Jake or no Jake. The bar was called the Grizzly Tavern. It was wedged between a laundromat and a tobacco shop in a tiny strip mall off the highway's access road. And it was open despite the fact that it wasn't even noon on a weekday, but that was the sort of crowd the Grizzly catered to. Amanda was unsurprised to see the flashing neon open sign on the tinted door as she and Jake got out of the Jeep. She could practically smell that particular mixture of bad beer and cigarette smoke that only clings to dive bars, well before she got close enough to the door to open it. She glanced at Jake and saw him flinch and turn his face away, and she wondered if he could smell it. He must have been able to smell it. That must have been an advantage or sometimes a curse of being what he was. She tugged open the door and got a full blast of that smell right in the face. She thought she heard Jake gag softly behind her. The place was so grody it made Benson's look like the Ritz. A thick layer of grime covered every surface. A fat cloud of cigarette and cigar smoke crowded the atmosphere. Sickly yellow lights shone overhead on every surface that didn't have an ass or an elbow on it. The place hadn't been cleaned in decades. Amanda headed for the bar, trying to ignore how her shoes stuck to the floor as she walked. Even old Cal would have tried to wipe down the bar with a lick of his sleeve if it got this bad. The owner, Hank Harrison, was slouched behind the bar watching the only two patrons, but both of them were already nose-deep in their frosty mugs. Amanda slid between two of the stools to sit across from Hank. Jake stood back, hands in his pockets. "Amanda," Hank said, voice drawling as his eyes moved between her and her partner. "Given a tour or something?" Amanda smiled. "Not exactly. How are you, Hank?" "Can't complain." Amanda looked down the bar. She knew the other two men drinking, one of whom had definitely already been tagged for illegal hunting, but she kept her focus on Hank. He was in his 60s with long scraggly gray hair and an even longer scragglier gray beard. But he had good eyes, she thought, warm brown, kindly even if they were a bit guarded. And he'd never been a shit to her, which was something she appreciated. "That's my new partner, don't mind him," she said. "He's still not sure what to make of our little town." Hank flashed her a toothy smile. "Most don't, eh?" "Nope." She leaned on the bar and tried not to think about what was getting all over her shirt in the process. "Listen, Hank, I'm not going to lean on you, okay? We're looking to talk to some of the boys who don't pay as much attention to the hunting laws as maybe they should. But we're not out to arrest anybody. We just want to talk. You know anybody who might be willing to answer a few questions for me?" Hank's warm brown eyes narrowed a little, and he looked past Amanda towards Jake, but Amanda kept her eyes on his face. Hank sighed heavily as he looked back at her and nodded. "Might be I know a few boys who'd talk to you," he said quietly, and a flick of his eyes down the bar indicated what she already knew. "For a price." "How about the day's drinking on me?" she asked, pulling her wallet from her jacket pocket. "Does that sound about right?" Hank pulled a beer from a cooler behind the bar and headed down the counter towards the other two patrons. As she expected, he went to the man at the other end of the bar who wore a camo trucker hat pulled down low over his brow. Amanda watched Hank set the beer in front of him and then duck his head, muttering quietly. Eventually the trucker hat nodded, and a grimy hand extended to take the beer. Hank waved Amanda over. She went without looking back at Jake. "Amanda," Hank said, gesturing to the trucker hat. "This man here'll answer some of your questions, but he don't want to give his name." Amanda thought she knew the man's name, but she just nodded and smiled amiably to the craggy face beneath the camo hat's brim. "Hi there. Nice to meet you. What you want to know?" he grumped. Hank moved back down the bar and Amanda pulled her phone out of her pocket to type in some notes as they spoke. "Have there been any new boys on the mountain this season?" she asked. "I mean in the postseason. Any new faces?" "Maybe a few. She nodded. And were any of them hunting anything unusual? Camo Hat squinted at her. Depends what you mean by unusual. Hard to say really. Just not the normal sort of sport, I mean. He shrugged. There were a few guys they were weird. Being real close-mouthed about what they were after but buying up all the big game supplies. My buddy Bert tried to get in on it but they shut him out. Said they were hunting for special pelts and he couldn't handle it, which is bullshit cause Bert is a great shot. A great shot. Amanda smiled again. I'm sure he is. So they never told him what sort of pelts these guys were after? No ma'am. But you might go ask Fred Jacobson up Highway 12 owns the last supply stop before you go off-road. It was him they were cleaning out. Might be he knows more than old Bert could say. Amanda nodded. She knew of the Jacobson outpost but had never been there herself. That was deep in the forest up the mountain. Only the really serious hunters stopped there. Thanks. She put her phone away and offered him another smile. I really appreciate your help. I really appreciate the beer tab, ma'am. Don't we all? Amanda shot a wave at Hank over the bar and then walked back. Without a glance spared back towards the trucker hat or to the other man at the bar. She grabbed Jake by the arm and pulled him out the doors on her way out. He let her drag him a few steps and then, once they were on the sidewalk outside, he shook her off. Worth the smell. Yes. She took his keys from her pocket and gestured him to the Jeep. He gave us a lead. That's more than we had before. You're very up and at 'em today. Jake got into the passenger seat without further argument of who was driving. What does that mean? She knew better than to try and drop him back at the station before she headed up the mountain, so she didn't even explain where they were going, she just drove. I mean, you seem particularly determined to solve this, Jake went on. Motivated. Maybe last night did you some good. If you're going to be an asshole, I'm going to drop you on the side of the road and you can walk back to the station. I'm not being an asshole. You seem invigorated. It has nothing to do with you. No. Unless you mean that I want to solve this case so that you'll get the fuck out of my town, then yes, I guess that has to do with you. No, I meant that a good fuck has made you alive again, Amanda. She very nearly slammed on the brakes so she could just kick him right out of the car, but she didn't. Instead, she gripped the steering wheel and kept her eyes on the road, though she could feel that familiar flush of hot temper in her face. She told herself not to let him get to her, not to give him the satisfaction. We're going up to one of the older outposts. It's far up the mountain. I've never really been there. But that guy said that there were illegal hunters up here not too long ago and they were hunting big game, but they wouldn't say what it was. I think it's probably people like you. You think the outpost owner will be able to identify the hunters? Jake said. Yes. So that's a big fucking lead. If it is them, if it is some kind of hunting thing, can that even happen? They skin shifters for pelts. Jake was quiet a moment. Yes, he finally said. I didn't think of it. You're from a big city. Why would you? Because it's smart. Oh, shocker. There's someone in the world smarter than you. Amanda managed not to roll her eyes while driving. Before he could say something shitty, she went on. Look, this is the kind of place you're in. You've just been blindly following these people around trying to catch them. You have to figure out who they are and what they want if you plan to catch them. They won't just walk into you one day. She heard him snort. I know that. But you haven't been doing the work. I've been working on this case a lot fucking longer than you have, detective. I've definitely done the work. Yeah, your wolfy whatever shifter work. Not your police work. She was expecting him to snap at her, but when he didn't, she thought maybe she'd finally made a dent. And she was proud of herself both for standing up for herself and for being able to talk about what he was without flinching or thinking herself crazy. This was a real thing that was happening. This was crazy shit, and it was happening in real life. Her real life. And she was handling it. She was handling Jake. Chapter 12. He didn't want to admit that Amanda was right, so Jake said nothing at all for most of their drive up the mountain. He told himself it wasn't so much that she was right, just that he was thinking about what she said. He'd been obsessive, he knew that. He'd been focused on finding this killer, but perhaps he had given the wolf in his heart too much reign over his mind. He was so deep in it sometimes that he had to let the wolf take over. He was afraid he'd seen too much to let the man rule. The man was weak. The wolf was fearless. But perhaps the man just had to be stronger to solve this, as it seemed to be. Men who were perpetrating the crimes. He watched the landscape change out the jeep's window as they drove deeper into the forest and then further up the mountain. The trees clustered and crowded the side of the road. The man-made paths began to thin and then disappear altogether. Nature grew wild around the road, which went from 4 lanes to 2. The traffic grew sparse the deeper into the wilderness they drove. The sun was still bright in the sky, but soon enough the canopy of tree limbs and leaves began to block it out, dappling the windshield in shadows. He was impressed by Amanda, but he wouldn't say it. He wasn't sure it would have gotten him anything to say it, and she clearly just wanted to be rid of him, which was exactly what he should have wanted, but he didn't. He wanted her to want him, wanted to linger in her presence, wanted to touch her again. He hated that. So he tried to say the worst things he could think of, tried to get her to reveal her meaner self so that he had something to dislike. But she never gave it to him. She just kept becoming more and more appealing instead. Even the wolf inside him was growing accustomed to her scent, finding it more pleasant. Somehow, despite the soft, helpless humanness of it. As before, they had to park well down the mountain and go by foot to get to Jacobson's outpost. As soon as they got out of the jeep, Jake caught the scent of the local pack on the air. He was well into their territory, which certainly accounted for the hunter's interest. "Stay close," he told Amanda, as he took the lead to walk them up the barely visible trail. "What is it?" "The local pack. I can smell them. They might show up. Just stay close to me. I'll handle it." "But you told them that I wasn't a threat, didn't you?" He looked at her. Her eyes were so bright with intellect and innocence. "I told them. That doesn't mean that they'll take kindly to us tromping into their territory." "Well, we've got a job to do." She tucked her hands into the pockets of her leather jacket as they walked, shrugging. "And they'll have to understand that we're trying to find out who's been killing their pack members. Wolves don't follow your human rules, Amanda. We've got our own. They're not working. We're going to solve these murders, and I won't let them get in my way. If they want to get in your way, Amanda, I suggest you let them. And then you run." "No. This is my case." Jake sighed and just shook his head. There was no explaining the wolf and the pack to a human woman. She'd never have understood. It wasn't personal, they had to take care of their own. Jake had learned it all the hard way when he was younger. Not a day went by that he didn't wish he'd listened better to his mother when she told him he was going to get himself in trouble one day. Now, it was too late for him, but maybe he could keep this local pack together and alive. The outpost was easily a mile up from the road. He kept looking at Amanda to see if she needed to stop and rest, but she never looked tired. Perhaps determination gave her strength, or maybe it was fear, although since the night before he had sensed no fear in her. There should have been more fear. More staring at him like he was a monster, but she did none of that. He'd never thought there was a human capable of so swiftly reconciling the existence of his kind. It was another way she kept surprising him. He'd half expected her to try and arrest him, to completely forget attempting to solve these murders since they were being committed against people who were not like her. But instead she came at it all with more ferocity than he'd ever seen in a human. He caught his thoughts turning towards other ferocious acts he'd like to see from her. Imagined pinning her to the forest floor and fucking her, or better yet, having her pin him. He shook his head, trying to get rid of the sudden hunger in his belly. Now was not the time. Over a steep ridge they finally saw the outpost. Like all the hunting outposts Jake had seen on this mountain, it was just several little shacks all built together, interlocking like Lincoln logs. Smoke puffed from a chimney that jutted up from one section's slanted roof, and there was a sign swinging from a large post down a narrow path proclaiming the owner's name. Jake headed down the ridge first, choosing his steps carefully, and led Amanda along behind him. At one point she slipped a little and he reached out and caught her arm, then held her the rest of the way down. She didn't argue or try to shrink back from him, but let him help her. "Do you smell anything?" she asked him as they approached the sign and the path. "I smell a lot of things. We're in the damned woods. I mean, do you smell other shifters?" "It's hard to parse," he admitted. "I know this is pack territory, but I'm not familiar enough with their scents. I don't know if I'm just smelling them or something else. So stay sharp." Clever girl, he thought. She'd already figured out that his senses were ever so much stronger than hers. And he did think he was smelling something unusual, but it was so unusual that he couldn't put his finger quite on what it was. Definitely not wolf. Not a scent he was overly familiar with, but something definitely different. He didn't mention it, though. He might have been wrong. It would just add to all the questions they didn't have answers to. He couldn't tell if the outpost was even open until they pulled on the front door. Part of it was a store, and the rest of it must have been the house Fred Jacobson lived in year-round. As he walked into the place, he got struck by a new round of smells. Herbs and gunpowder would smoke and steel. And something absolutely shifter, but it wasn't a wolf. There were shelves and shelves of weapons and survival supplies, from tents and sleeping bags to travel lanterns, and mosquito netting, bows and rifles and fishing tackle. He walked between the aisles and Amanda followed him towards the counter at the back of the shop. He put an arm out to stop her and keep her behind him, though when he saw the outpost owner, the man was sitting behind the counter, seemingly quite benign. But when their eyes met, Jake knew what he was looking at. Another shifter. Was like an electric spark between them, that knowledge. The man must have been in his 50s, hair once brown but now mostly gray. His eyes were more green than hazel, and his face was full of ridges and cracks, his skin weathered by the elements and the wilderness in the shadow of the mountain. He looked back at Jake and got to his feet. What is it? Amanda asked, trying to look around him. He held her back. You're not from the pack, Jacobson said. No. Jake used his free hand to pull his badge from his belt. We're from Prowler's Bluff. Jacobson sat slowly back down behind the counter, his expression scrutinizing. He knows about the pack? Amanda whispered. He can fucking hear you, Jake sighed. Is he a wolf too? No, Jacobson said, and he smiled a little. No, miss, I am not. And I won't hurt you. Come on out. The pack has already been by, though. I can't tell you anything more than I told them. Amanda ducked beneath Jake's arm before he could stop her and pulled out her phone to read over the guy's notes from the hunter bar. Jake bit down on it. Curson followed right behind her, keeping her within arm's reach. Well, she was saying, I spoke to one of the local hunters and he said there was a group up here not long ago looking to hunt big game, but they wouldn't say what. That's a fact, miss. Amanda looked at him, and now she was the one scrutinizing. And you're a shifter, and you didn't think that was weird? Jacobson blinked at her in surprise. Listen, miss. Detective. Amanda held up her badge to Barnes. Detective Barnes, I ain't never heard of humans who know about shifters, let alone ones out to hunt us down. I just sold them supplies and paid them no mind. Next thing I know, poor Stanley is dead and so is Esther. You know, we spent holidays together, her and me, sometimes alone up here like we were. Esther was a member of the local pack, Jake said. Yeah, not me. But sometimes she took pity on me and brought me a casserole. Do you at least have names for these guys? Amanda asked. Credit card. Numbers. Anything. Jacobson hesitated, looking at Amanda. Might be I got a credit card receipt here somewhere, actually, ma'am. Mississippi detective. Amanda made a motion for him to produce it. He ducked below the counter and started digging through a box of old handwritten receipts. The pack didn't ask about that? Amanda asked, frowning. The pack is more concerned with things like how they smell, what they were carrying, which ways they came and went from. Wolf packs don't have credit, Jake muttered. Well, that's totally antiquated. Jake frowned. It's just the way it is. Jacobson popped back up with one of the receipts. He set it on the counter and started smoothing out its wrinkled edges. Ah, this is one, he said, sliding it towards Amanda. You can use this to find them? It's a start. Amanda picked up the receipt, looking at it. Will you arrest him? Jacobson asked. Not yet. Amanda pulled a plastic baggie from her pocket and slipped the receipt into it. We don't have proof yet that they did anything. They didn't leave any identifying evidence at the scene. So you'll kill him? Amanda blinked and stared at Jacobson. Jake reached out and took her arm, pulling her a few steps back. No, he told Jacobson. We won't kill him. That won't stop this from happening again, and we want to stop it for good. If the pack finds him first, they'll just kill him, Jacobson pointed out. Jake nodded. I understand why. But we need to get ahead of this, not keep chasing it. Do you have any suggestions? I ain't never seen him here before, Jacobson said. First season they come. But they were pros. They knew what they could get away with in the off season. You ask me, they've been doing this a long time and there's probably more of them. They're taking pelts like prizes, Jake told him grimly. We have to stop all of it, not just these men in particular. As Jake watched, some of the color drained from Jacobson's face and he nodded. I hope you do then, detective. And you might go to the pack for help. Alistair is not unreasonable. Go with confidence and respect and he won't kill you. Worst he'll do is turn you away. I tried speaking to Alistair, Jake sighed. It didn't go that well. Try again now you got something to say, Jacobson suggested. Jake frowned, but he nodded. He didn't like the idea of going back to Alistair. Pack alphas did not like him as a rule, but they were going to have to work together on this, he thought, if they were going to solve it. Thank you, Mr. Jacobson, Amanda said. You've been very helpful. I feel responsible, Jacobson admitted quietly. I feel like if I'd known better I could have seen it coming. Stopped it. Only it's just so bizarre. Those poor people, hunted, skinned, like animals. He looked directly at Amanda. And we are not animals, detective. No, I don't think you are, Amanda said. We're going to stop this, I promise. Jacobson nodded and looked down. Jake looked at Amanda and she looked back at him and he nodded for the door. They thanked Jacobson again and then headed out, and Jake was deep in thought as they emerged from the outpost and started back through the woods towards where they'd parked. You're awfully quiet, Amanda said as they walked. He frowned a little harder. I'm thinking. About what? About how we're going to stop these people. Do you want to know what I think? He looked at her sidelong and nodded. Yes. Amanda inhaled. I think that there must be a market for shifter pelts. Otherwise, why hunt them and skin them? And if we can figure out the market and who's running it, that's how we stop this from happening. Jake's eyebrows arched in surprise. That's a very smart notion. Amanda actually smiled a little. See, if it's been happening all over the place, it's because these hunters are going where they know the game is, but they don't stay and wipe out the source. They're moving, leaving some to replenish the herd. But it's economics. Supply and demand. We have to find the source of the demand. Jake was nodding. All right. So we start by finding one of them, and lean on him to find the others, and start looking for rare pelt dealers. Stuff on the black market, baby seal or whatever. Amanda was already on her phone, using the internet as they tromped through the forest. I'll dig into that stuff, see if I can't find anything and make a bid myself. Maybe we can get in that way. Jake found himself wanting to thank her. The impulse came upon him so suddenly that the words were almost past his lips before he could stop himself. But he was grateful. Maybe it was seeing Jacobson look so guilty for having let this happen, even though it wasn't the man's fault. It wasn't Jake's fault either. But he'd felt for so long like he was the only one fighting this losing battle, that it might as well have been. Amanda had only just discovered that such things existed in the world, and she was already determined enough to save them that she was putting her whole self into finding the source of these murders. And Jake was grateful, so grateful, that she was smart and creative and that she kept thinking of things that he never would. For the first time in years, Jake thought perhaps he actually stood a chance of putting a stop to this. But Jake wasn't the kind of guy who said thank you, not if he could avoid it. Not for things that meant this much to him anyway. He said thanks after a good fuck up against a bar bathroom wall, or when the gas attendant handed him his change. But he never said thank you for anything of substance, nor to anyone that mattered. It was becoming plain that Amanda mattered to him. She mattered to him now. But he couldn't tell her that. He didn't know how. Instead, as they walked, he reached over and caught her hand, then just pressed her up against the nearest tree and kissed her deeply. He crushed his mouth to hers and felt her body tense up, but he pinned her wrist to the tree bark and tasted her. He thought for a second that she didn't want it until he felt her free hand sink into his hair, and then her mouth answered his and their tongues touched, the kiss heating up rapidly between them. Her body relaxed and he let go of her wrist, sliding his hands up from her waist to cradle her ribcage. Her arms hooked around his neck and he felt her fingers tighten in his hair, which summoned a growl from the back of his throat. He pulled her away from the tree, turning to spill her down to the ground beneath him. But even as she landed on her back in the grass and he pushed her knees apart, reaching for the belt at her hips, he realized she'd let go of him. Then he felt her hands on his chest pushing him back, and with a gasp and a furious noise he let go of her and sat back. His heart was hammering away and he looked down to see her flushed and desirous beneath him, but her hands were still beneath them, palms up in a gesture of halt. "Stop," she said, breathless. "I did stop," he snapped, running his hands back through his hair. He had to look away from her at anything else but her. "I stopped." She pushed herself up on her elbows and slid out from underneath him, backing away a few feet. He sat back on his heels watching her, wanting her, but he stayed rooted to the spot because she told him to stop. "You can't just do that," she cried, struggling to get back to her feet. "You can't just kiss me and think that because I kiss you back I'm going to let you fuck me right here in the middle of nowhere." He slammed a fist into the ground and then shoved himself up to his feet, trying to breathe through the desire and the anger flooding through him. "What's so wrong with the middle of nowhere? Are you kidding me?" She grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it at him. He ducked and glared at her. "What the hell is wrong with you? You were into it. You just said you were kissing me back." "Yes, but that doesn't mean I'm going to let you tear my clothes off in and screw me in the dirt." It was like she was speaking an entirely different language. He looked at the ground and the trees and the sky. It was a beautiful day. The forest was beautiful. It smelled like wolves and fresh life. "There's grass," he said, confusedly pointing. It's not just dirt. There's grass and leaves and stuff. Why are you so fucking angry at me? Why do you keep doing that?" "What?" she sputtered. "Just out of nowhere you kiss me and then you fuck me and then you say shitty things to me." "I wasn't." "You do. That's what you keep doing." He snapped his teeth at her. "I wanted you. That's what I do when I want something. I take it." "I'm not an it," she shouted. "I'm a me. And you can't just take me, do you? Understand? No more just taking. I'm a person and a woman, and if you want some sort of romantic thing with me, then you have to like date me or some shit. You can't just come over to my house or push me up against a tree, or you have to be normal about it." There was so much anger flashing in her bright blue eyes. So much life flushed into her pale skin, and she was beautiful, Jake thought in her rage. And she was pissed. He knew she was pissed, and that he had done this all wrong. Then again, he hadn't exactly meant to do anything, but what had always worked for him before was apparently not going to work for him now, not with Amanda. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd been treating her like a thing to take when he wanted it. He hadn't meant to do that. He just didn't know how to do any of this. She kicked dirt at him and then turned to stomp further down the path. Chapter 13. Amanda was so furious she almost forgot to pick her phone up from where it had fallen into the dirt, so she had to turn back after stomping off so spectacularly, and there was Jake following her, holding out her phone. She snatched it from his hand and resumed her stomping. She couldn't believe he'd just stood there and told her that there was also grass and stuff after trying to fuck her out in the open woods like an animal. And then when she told him exactly why she was so angry, he just stood there staring at her like he had no idea what she was saying. Was it so ridiculous? To want to be wooed and dated and maybe to have a little goddamned candlelight? Was romance just completely freaking dead? Did men not give flowers anymore? Did men not have sex in beds anymore? She supposed it was her own fault, letting him take her in his hotel room the way she had, and then again just right there in her own kitchen up against the counter. But no, it wasn't her fault. She should have spoken up before. Maybe, but it wasn't her fault. It was definitely his fault. This was definitely ridiculous. "Amanda," he said. But she saw the Jeep now and she didn't slow down. "Amanda." She wouldn't look at him because she couldn't stand to see the longing in his dark eyes. Lust and longing and something wild, the wolf, she supposed. Those things had been bright in his gaze when he'd let her go. "Amanda, please." She turned sharply around to glare at him expectantly. "What?" She wondered if he couldn't even get the words out, if he actually knew how to say them, or if he just never learned them at all. "You what?" His expression contorted and he looked down, running a hand back through the dishevelment of his hair.
"I'm sorry, Amanda."
"I wasn't thinking." She huffed, folding her arms, surprised that he'd managed to say it, and also somewhat dubious. because how could she not be? I don't want you to do that ever again, she said. He looked up startled. What? You don't want me to kiss you again? She blushed, felt the warmth and the color rush suddenly into her cheeks, and some of the anger fled from her when she saw the dismay in his face. I don't want you to kiss me like that again, no? You mean up against the tree? More or less. Fine. He put up his hands. I won't ever kiss you up against a tree again. Stop being an asshole, she snapped at him. I don't want you to treat me like I'm just some bimbo fuck toy. That's what I mean, Jake. He dropped his hands, looking around like maybe he was lost, or maybe there were going to be cue cards or something that would tell him what to say. Typical, she thought. Typical fucking guy who'd never had a real conversation with a woman about feelings or anything important in his whole life. All right, he finally said, nodding. His eyes were still low. All right, I get it, I won't. And you're sorry you did already? He winced a little around his eyes like it hurt him to apologize. Yes. I'm sorry I treated you that way. I lost control of myself. Bullshit. She shook her head. Bullshit. Fine, I didn't lose control of myself, I just thought you would want it too, and I was wrong, I see that now. Amanda tried to keep the glare in her eyes. He wasn't wrong, not entirely. A part of her had wanted it. A part of her had wanted him. A very big part of her still did. But not like that. Well, part of her had definitely wanted it like that, but it wasn't her heart. Her heart wanted something more, and she was tired of feeling like crap because she let him get away with that kind of thing. She was tired of feeling like he didn't care. Either he had to actually care or she wasn't going to do this anymore. She shoved a spill of hair back from her eyes and realized there was a damn leaf in her hair that almost made her burst into tears again. Do you care about me? She asked him quietly. At all. His posture changed. His shoulders lifted, defensive, and he started to pace a little in tight circles. A few steps this way, a few steps back. Anxiety bottled into a single man. Of course I care about you, he finally said. We're partners. You're smart. I care about you. I mean, in the you keep kissing me way, do you care about me? She pressed. I think so. You think so? I'm still figuring it all out, he snapped, stopping his pacing to scowl at her. All right. I'm trying to figure it out. So I think so. Well, that's not good enough. She wasn't going to cry. She told herself not to cry. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the keys to the Jeep, squeezing them so tight that the keys' teeth started to bite into the flesh of her palm. Jake, it's not good enough. Now I actually don't want you to kiss me again, ever. Amanda, listen. He came towards her and she took a step back, so he stopped a few feet away. He held out his hands, but she wouldn't reach for him. He sighed. Isn't that how it works? You kiss them and figure out if you care about each other. Isn't that basically dating? Not when you're also fucking in kitchens and forests, Jake, she muttered. That is definitely not dating. I do care about you, I'm just what? I'm in the middle of this fucking case. We are in the middle of this case. Yes, and there's a lot riding on it for me, and I'm just not. I can't. What do you even want? Do you want me to say I love you or some shit? Just met you. She scoffed, and that made her angry again, so she grit her teeth and glared. Some more. No, that's not what I want. Then what is it? Nothing. I want nothing from you, Jake. At all. Amanda, come on. No, you know what? You figure out what you fucking want and you let me know. And until then, don't you dare fucking touch me. Keys in hand, she turned to stalk the rest of the way back to the Jeep. She just needed to get off the mountain, to drop him off and get on her bike and ride for a while, to get rid of all these feelings, to forget the feel of his hands and the taste of his mouth and sounds he made when he kissed her. To just fucking forget all that. Except as she turned, she felt his hands on her, and she let out a yelp and dropped her phone and the keys all at once as he lifted her feet right off the ground. He crushed her back to his chest and dragged her back, and she started to flail to tell him to fuck off and put her down, but then she saw why. Pair of wolves came slinking out from beneath the Jeep. Another 4 of them came around the truck itself, and then there was the gray wolf from before, the leader of the pack. They'd surrounded the vehicle. They'd been waiting for them. Chapter 14. Jake manhandled Amanda around and behind him, but as he turned in a circle he realized that the wolves had them properly surrounded. He bit down on a curse. He should have been paying more attention to their surroundings and less attention to Amanda's fucking feelings. If they wound up dead because of her emotional meltdown over a kiss, he was going to hell with very little to show for it except fury and stupidity. Behind him, Amanda drew her sidearm and started swinging it around, aiming at any of the wolves that came closest. Back off. But Jake twisted, grabbing the gun right out of her hands. Stop it, he snapped. They haven't attacked yet, stop. Don't provoke them. They're wolves, do they even need provocation? Yes. He looked at her over his shoulder and then just tucked her sidearm, safety on, into the front of his belt and turned back to the larger gray wolf, and put up his hands. We don't want to fight, Alistair. When the gray wolf's eyes met his, however, he couldn't quite help that. He bared his teeth a little. That kind of challenge was impossible for him to resist. His independent nature made him extra aggressive, and Amanda at his back only made it worse. She was a woman he'd scent-marked, and that scent was mixing with her fear. Jake struggled to keep the wolf in his heart under control as Alistair prowled forward, breaking ranks with the rest of the pack. And to Jake's relief, he started to shift. Jake felt Amanda leaning around trying to see it, and he could also feel her heart rate ramp up towards a gallop as she watched the great gray wolf's bone crunching, skin-stretching transformation. It was quick but always brutal, especially watching from the outside. The way the limbs stretched and broadened and broke, the sudden recession of the fur across a landscape of human skin, and the sounds it made. The sounds Jake thought were probably the worst. But after a few seconds, Alistair was shoving himself upright on 2 human feet, and pushing long gray hair out of his eyes. Amanda was practically clinging to Jake's back, digging her fingers into his shirt. Slowly, Jake lowered his hands. We don't want to fight, he said again. Alistair nodded, and the rest of the pack started to inch back towards a respectful distance. Jake felt Amanda's fingers start to loosen their grip on him. There's been another, Alistair said, voice gruff from the change in what Jake thought must have been grief. Another death. Another murder? Amanda popped out from behind Jake as soon as the most obvious danger was gone. Jake sighed. Skinned. Alistair frowned and looked at her, nodding. Jake saw a blush burst into her cheeks. Alistair was, of course, naked. Jake was used to that, but apparently Amanda was having some difficulty keeping her eyes on Alistair's face, which pissed Jake off, but he tried to keep a grip on his temper. Getting into fight with Alistair now wasn't going to do anything but get them into more trouble. So he let Amanda get all caught up in looking at the naked pack alpha and just stood there and boiled inside himself. Yes, Alistair was telling Amanda. The same as before. We need to see the body, Amanda insisted. Alistair's jaw tightened.
No.
No more investigating. We are going to attack the town below. Clearly the murderer is hiding there. All the color drained right out of Amanda's face. That doesn't make any sense. You have no way of knowing which of the people, if any of them, are involved in this. 3 of your people die, so you're just going to arbitrarily murder human beings as revenge. Alistair bared his teeth at Amanda, and Jake stepped forward, catching her by the arm to pull her back a step, but she shook him violently off and then actually shoved him back. He was so surprised he let her. We have hidden for generations, Alistair said. The whole of the shifter population, hidden out of sight of the humans. Now they hunt us in our own shadows. We'll let them know they can't. We need more time, Amanda said. Jake and I, we have a lead. We need some time to look into it. Please don't punish innocent people. We can find these killers and make it right. Alistair's eyes narrowed. You think there is more than one killer? Amanda nodded. Yes, which makes the case more complex than we'd originally thought. Please, we just need time. Alistair looked from her to Jake, and Jake folded his arms, trying to look as strong as he could without seeming to challenge the alpha. He knew this was going to have to be delicate. He also knew that he was not a particularly
delicate man.
You're working with this human woman, Alistair said, nodding to Amanda. You've told her our secrets. She's smart, Jake muttered. She's smarter than you and me. I know that this is your territory, that you know this mountain better than anyone, but she knows the people who live here better, and it's humans doing this, Alistair. We need her. You need her. And together we can solve this, I know it. She's right. We just need more time. Alistair let out a growl and looked away. Jake could easily understand his frustration. He'd been in a similar situation himself. He had sympathy for the pack, but he knew that things would only get worse if they tried to take out their anger on innocent people. Surely Alistair would know that too if he took a moment to think through his anger. I will give you time, Alistair finally said. How much time? Amanda pressed. Jake was going to have a talk with her about pack dynamics and where she fit into them, which was basically the bottom. He was impressed that Alistair hadn't pinned her to the ground with his teeth at her neck already. As it was, Alistair bared his teeth at her again. A week. Amanda stared at him. A week is not enough time to solve a multiple homicide. If you haven't made progress in a week, we'll have to reevaluate, Alistair said. You think you can do this, human? Solve the deaths of our people? Deaths at your people's hands? Then you have a week to prove it. Then we take these matters into our hands. Before Amanda could say anything else and piss Alistair off more, Jake said, Thank you, Alistair. We'll prove that we can do it. I hope you do, Alistair said. Then he turned, and the pack all turned in almost perfect synchronicity, following their alpha back into the deep green shadows of the forest around them. Jake watched them disappear, and then he bent down, scooping Amanda's keys and cell phone from where they'd landed in the dirt. He held them wordlessly out to her. She took them, a frown on her lovely mouth. It's not enough time, she muttered. I know, but it's all the time we've got. I've never heard of any homicide case being closed in a week, Jake. We don't have to close it, Amanda, we just have to get the pack on our side. If you want to stop them from killing senselessly, you have to give them sense, motivation, something to hope for. Right now they feel like they're being picked off one by one and they're powerless to stop it. Do you understand? They're animals backed into a corner. They're going to lash out. Amanda's frown deepened. Jacobson said that you aren't animals. Jake rolled his eyes. The metaphor still works. Amanda headed towards the driver's side. I'm going to find this guy and get to work. Jake frowned and hesitated, but he let her climb into the driver's seat and went around to the passenger side. I want to help you, Amanda. I don't want to work with you right now. We're partners. I'm still pissed at you. That doesn't mean we're not partners. You can't shut me out of this case. He pulled the door shut and she put the keys in the ignition, then turned her head and glared at him. I need some time. You keep saying that, he snapped, temper sparking though he struggled to keep a hold on it. To me, to Alistair. We don't have time. Just give me something to do, all right? If you're going to go look up the guy on the receipt, fine, just don't go find him without me. He could be dangerous. And give me something to do in the meantime. I can't be useless like the pack. I came here to solve this. Fine. She looked straight ahead. Fine. I'll find this guy. You get on the internet and see what you can find about pelt black markets. There has to be something weird, something about this. It's the fucking internet. Jake watched her profile for another moment before he sat back in his seat and grit his teeth together, basically chewing on his own frustration. He wanted to fix a lot of things that he simply couldn't, it seemed. He wanted to fix this case, to find these killers and kill them with his bare hands. And he wanted to fix Amanda, to make her understand who and what he was, but he kept getting caught up in the thought of his hands on her, feeling her instead of killing her. He had no answers. He was as useless as Alistair as the pack, especially when it came to her. But at least she wasn't yelling at him right now. He thought maybe if he could keep her from yelling at him for a while, maybe he stood a chance. So he kept his mouth shut as she drove them back down the mountain to Prowler's Bluff. Chapter 15. Amanda dropped Jake off at the station, and for once he didn't put up a fight about it. She was loath to admit it, but it was kind of disappointing when he just took the keys to the Jeep from her and got in without saying anything. She wondered if she'd made a mistake in the woods, if she'd pushed him too far away. But wasn't that what she wanted? Didn't she want him to just back off until he could actually have a feeling instead of just a desire? She was struggling with what she wanted from him suddenly, and that was definitely worse than struggling with Jake himself. She watched the vehicle peel out of the parking lot as she shouldered open the station door. She brought the receipt to Elaine and showed her the name she wanted her to run. Elaine promised to do it straight away, so Amanda decided to linger at the stationed to see if the info would turn up quickly. She couldn't help wondering what Jake was doing, if he was looking into the black market internet stuff, like she told him to, or if he was doing something more wolfy. She got coffee and went to her desk. As she sat, staring at her computer screen, waiting for an email from Elaine, her eyelids started to feel heavier and heavier. A shadow spilled across her shoulder. She looked up. It was Captain Martin, and his expression was grim as ever, his brow furrowed. "You look like hell," he said. "Thanks." Amanda smiled tiredly. "Go home." "I'm waiting for an email, Captain." "You have email at home, Amanda." "I checked the logs. You got here at like 4:30 a.m. It is now 4:30 p.m. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say you haven't slept. I just want to get somewhere on this case. You're literally sitting here falling asleep at your desk. You're no good to anybody. Go home and get some rest, and maybe by the time you're awake you'll have that email from Elaine." He snorted a laugh. "You know how slow she types. Even if she's got something right now, you're not gonna get it for a few hours." Amanda couldn't help but smile, which broadened into a full-on yawn. She covered her mouth and nodded, and started hauling herself up from her seat. Was no good arguing with the captain when he had that look on his face, and she knew it. "All right, I'll go home. For the night." She sighed. "Captain, go home and get a full night's sleep. I'm gonna tell Andy not to even let you in those doors before 7 a.m. tomorrow, got it?" Amanda made a face, but she nodded and grabbed her things. She slogged between the detectives' desks towards the station doors. By the time she got home, she knew that the captain had been right. Her brain was fuzzy and her eyes were groggy, and she was struggling to think about anything but Jake and errant details from the case that kept buzzing round her mind. A week. They had a week to find out who was behind all of this, or at least get so much closer that the pack would be satisfied, or else innocent people in Prowler's Bluff were going to start dying. More innocent people. And she couldn't explain to the captain or anyone what they were up against. She'd be committed to the nearest psych ward and forgotten about. But it was real. There were people hunting other people who turned into wolves, and she couldn't stop thinking about Jake turning into a wolf, or the pack alpha turning from wolf into man. The noises it had made, the feelings she'd had. She wished she could just turn all her feelings off. She didn't even make it to bed. She went right to the sofa and just fell onto it, fully dressed, and was asleep in minutes. To her relief, she had an email from Elaine when she woke. She'd slept for nearly 12 hours, according to the clock that read 4 a.m. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes and sat up on the sofa, grabbing her phone as she headed into the kitchen to make coffee. While the coffee percolated, she read through all the known information on Tom Glenwood, whose credit card had been used at Jacobson's outpost. Amanda's stomach grumbled, so she grabbed a handful of Oreos out of the kitchen cabinet and dunked them in her coffee as she read. Tom Glenwood wasn't a local, so there wasn't too much information on him, but he'd been to town a few times over the years. He'd had one count of drunk and disorderly last year, so thankfully there was a picture in the database. Out-of-towners often couldn't handle drinking in the higher mountain atmosphere. As all the locals knew, you had to pace yourself. He'd been arrested outside Benson's, not the Grizzly, which meant he wasn't one of the boys' club hunters, or maybe he'd just been moonlighting with the other locals at Benson's. Still, she had a picture of one of these guys, and that was more than she'd had the day before. His last known address was somewhere in Arizona, though, and that was no help at all. She could have them tag the license plate on his last known vehicle, but she'd have to explain why, and that would get her some looks. She thought maybe she could get Elaine to do it as a favor without logging it, but that was perilously close to dirty business, and Amanda just didn't like the way it felt. Halfway through her second cup of coffee, when she was starting to think maybe the cookies weren't going to cut it and she'd have to cook something, she got a text from Jake. "Awake?" She hesitated and considered not replying, but she was awake and she felt a pull to him, even if it was a dangerous one, and he'd been right in the end. They were partners. They had to work together. Work, she reminded herself. Work. Just work. They couldn't do anything else together, because he was basically the emotional equivalent of a toddler. So she replied, "Yes. Got something?" "Me too." "Your place?" "Just work. No, meet me at the diner downtown, it's open. Cozy's Waffles. Half an hour." "Fine." She left her phone and her coffee and the last of her Oreos on the counter and went to take a shower. Chapter 16. Jake was sitting at the diner's counter, waiting for Amanda, going over it all. In his mind, he'd done some internet research like Amanda suggested, and sure enough there'd been plenty of dark places on the internet where things like skinning people and people pelts popped up, but most of it was bullshit. It wasn't until he'd reached out to one of his shadier contacts outside Chicago that he'd gotten any kind of realistic lead. The rest? Porn. But that was the internet for you. His contact outside Chicago, Lem, was a lone shifter who'd never had a pack runt, and he'd fallen in with the wrong crowd early on in life, kept getting himself in trouble. After Jake lost his pack, he'd started looking out for the guy because he could understand what Lem was going through to a point. But Lem never managed to climb out of the hole he dug for himself, so Jake still helped him, and sometimes Lem managed to help Jake as well. It was an odd source, but Jake had been at ends, and so he'd reached out, and Lem amazingly had come through. Kind of. He'd definitely heard of the pelt market. He said he'd ran into them once or twice and barely got out of it by the skin of his teeth. These motherfuckers were a small but enthusiastic group, and Lem said they'd been through Chicago twice in the last few years. Every time he lost some of the street shifters he knew, which were more populous than packs in big cities. Big city shifters just couldn't get their shit together most times. Too tame with a wild heart. Like Lem, they got themselves in trouble, and these guys had figured that out, too. Lem said the pelt market was an underground one, and that most of the time they were just trophies. Only a small dedicated bunch went out hunting for shifters. The rich members just bought them. That disgusted Jake to the point of fury, but he knew he didn't stand a chance at destroying the market entirely. If he could scare them enough that the hunting stopped, that was the best first step he could take to helping his own kind, especially the lost boys like Lem. When he asked Lem why he'd never told him about any of this before, he got the usual spin. Lem was drugged out and lost somewhere, and Jake scared the shit out of him. It made Jake feel terrible, and he wondered if Amanda wasn't right. That he got so caught up in himself that he didn't do the work. Being a cop meant being a detective and also saving people. And Jake was just fucking up. Left and right and front and center. He was so deep in his own thoughts that it took a minute to realize Amanda had sat down next to him at the counter. He looked at her and saw she'd gotten some sleep. He could smell soap on her skin from the shower. He was glad at least one of them had gotten some rest. "What did you find?" she asked without preamble, setting her phone on the counter. "I got a picture of the guy from Jacobson's." "That's something." Jake nodded. "That's definitely something." He gestured to the waitress for more coffee. "I talked to one of my contacts in Chicago. There's definitely a black market for pelts, been going on for years. Seems we're looking for the providers, these hunters. If we can stop them, maybe the market itself will dry up." Amanda's eyes focused on him so intensely that it made him uncomfortable. "Did your contact know where to find these people?" "Not here, not in Colorado." He pointed at her phone. "We'll use your picture of the guy for that. You should show it to the guys at that hunter bar." Amanda frowned. What if they all say they don't know him? Then they're lying. He was arrested outside Benson's, though. "I can ask Cal." "Do both." He shifted in his seat. "I hate these people, Amanda. I want to catch them." "Catch them or kill them?" He shrugged. "No difference. There is to me." When he looked at her again, he was surprised to see how earnest her expression was. He frowned. "I can't talk about this now, okay? But I know how you feel about it. And when we find this guy, I'm not going to kill him before he gives up the others." "Fine." But she did not seem fine with it at all. The waitress brought her a cup of coffee, and then Amanda ordered waffles. Jake thought about leaving. She clearly didn't want to work with him. He'd fuck that up good. "The pancakes are good here too," she said. "I should go. You should try the pancakes." He looked at her and she looked back at him, and he didn't know what to make of that. It had sounded like an invitation. In the end he nodded and ordered, and they ate in relative silence for a while. In spite of himself, just having Amanda sit beside him for that time made him relax some. The fact that she hadn't spat in his face and walked out of the diner again was a good start. But start to what? He couldn't think about that now either. After a while, Amanda leaned back and checked her phone. Grizzlies doesn't Open until 10. Then Benson's opens at noon. It's only 6:30. You should maybe get some sleep, you look tired. Yeah, maybe. He heard her sigh, but he didn't look at her. Jake, why don't you go get some sleep and then meet me at Grizzly's at 10? And we'll ask Hank together about this guy. Okay. Reluctantly, he looked at her. Yeah. Okay. And for fuck's sake, she smiled. It was so surprising that Jake almost did a double take. But then he found he didn't want to look away from that smile, bright and easy on her kissable mouth. We're going to get them, she said. Suddenly, he believed that maybe they actually could. Maybe it was the smile, or the coffee, or the fact that they'd just gotten a couple of small leads. Jake wasn't ready to think that it was just the force of Amanda's own determination. He wouldn't have liked to think that she had that much control over him. Not yet anyway. As they sat looking into each other's eyes, he thought maybe there might be something there, though. Maybe there might be more for them. And that thought scared him so much he did the only thing he knew how to. Can I come sleep at your place? He asked. The smile fell right off her face. What? He arched an eyebrow. You want me to be in a better mood, you're going to have to fuck me. He didn't know why he said it. As soon as it came out of his mouth, he had no idea what he'd hoped to accomplish by saying it. Maybe he was just doing his best to push her away, to disarm her of her sympathy for him. That, at least, certainly did. She smacked him hard across the face and got to her feet. His head snapped sideways and he could feel the handprints smearing up across his face, burning into his skin. He shook his head and squinted at her, watching as she snatched her phone and keys of the diner countertop. You're a fuckter, she snapped. Fuck you. He almost said that's the point, but he figured he'd already been smacked. So he stifled the impulse. She was right. He was being a fuckdirt, and normally he would have been able to at least say why, but for the moment he was at a loss. He felt exactly like the fuckdirt she thought he was now, with an aching face. He thought maybe he should get up and go after her, but instead he watched her storm out of the diner and just let her go. He didn't know what he was feeling, but he did know he had nothing to say that would do any good. Maybe it was better that she hated him. Maybe it was better for them both if she was so disgusted by him that she never thought of smiling at him ever again. He finished his pancakes once she was gone and paid the bill for both of them, then went back to his motel room to take a nap. Chapter 17. Amanda parked her bike outside Grizzly's. She checked her phone. No new messages. And she'd have been lying if she said she didn't want a message from Jake, one with an apology. But she was never going to get that. At this point, she'd be surprised if he even showed up to talk to Hank with her. She just couldn't believe what an asshole he was. Who talked like that? To anyone? How could he go on about caring about her? About wanting to be her partner, and then just, it was like a whole part of his brain, the normal part, was missing. All the filthy talk, the trying to just take her, the assumptions about what she wanted and needed and how it all made her feel. He clearly had no idea how to have a normal relationship of any kind. Not that Amanda could even call what they had normal. She just wished she could stop thinking about him altogether. She knew she couldn't, not until she'd solved this case at least. Focusing on the case was the only thing keeping her from falling completely apart. At least her anger. Jake was useful. She could bottle it up and use it to focus. That was the resolution she'd come to when she saw Jake pull up alongside her bike. Her heart did a little somersault towards her stomach because she couldn't decide whether she was relieved he came or frustrated because his very presence distracted her from the case. At least she told herself it did. But he didn't get out of the Jeep. He looked at her through the window then. Just looked straight ahead and sat there with the car still running. Amanda slammed her helmet onto the back of her bike a little harder than she'd meant to, but she didn't go over to the car. She just stood beside her bike and folded her arms, determined to wait. She could be just as stubborn as Jake. She could wait out his bullshit. And she did, until Hank came lumbering around the corner of the laundromat on the end of the strip mall block, pulling the keys to the bar out of his camouflage jacket. He came up short when he saw her standing there and Jake in the car beside her. He stopped outside the door to the bar and Amanda heard Jake finally turn off the Jeep. He climbed out of the passenger side and walked past her right towards Hank. Detective, good morning. Amanda hurried to slide in between them, getting in front of Jake with a smile. For Hank. Morning, Hank. We have a few more questions for you if you don't mind. Not at all, Amanda, Hank said carefully, his eyes moving from her to over her shoulder at Jake and back. Everything all right? We have a lead and we need your help, she said. Hank nodded and turned away from them to unlock the door to the bar. Amanda could feel the heat of Jake's body at her back, she could even hear him breathing. He couldn't have been that close. Maybe she was just imagining it. It was hard for her to focus on other things when she was looking at him. She couldn't let it get this bad just when she knew he was there. She tried to ignore him altogether, and the warmth of him and the memory of all the warmth of his body against hers. He didn't say anything as he followed her into the bar after Hank. Hank tucked the keys into his pocket and started drifting through the dark cavern of the bar, turning on lights that did very little to brighten the space. They illuminated pockets of dusty tables and the grimy floor. Amanda pulled out her phone and cut him off before he went behind the bar. I need you to tell me if you've ever seen this man before, Hank. She showed him the mugshot of Tom Glenwood. Hank pulled a pair of delicate reading glasses from the inside pocket of his camo jacket and slid them onto the bridge of his nose, squinting down at the picture on her phone. He frowned, took the phone from her hand and nodded a little. Yeah, he used to come in here. Used to? Amanda pressed. Hank nodded again and offered back the phone. I banned him. He pulled the glasses from his face, carefully folding them up again. Used to get drunk and rowdy. One too many fist fights over the pool table. When did you ban him? Amanda asked. 2 years ago. Amanda sighed. I see. So you haven't seen him in 2 years. Not in this bar. Hank straightened his shoulders a little. Once banned. Banned for life. Thanks, Hank. Amanda started to turn away, but Hank cleared his throat, so she turned back to him. He arched a scraggly eyebrow at her. With a faint roll of her eyes, she pulled out her wallet and slid a pair of 20s free from the fold, offering them over to him with a withering look. Hank cleared his throat again and took the cash, then smiled grimly. I hear he has a thing for the poker machines at Benson's, detective. If he's been in town since I kicked him out, he'll probably turn up there. Cal could tell. You. Amanda glared at him. You couldn't have just told me that for free, Hank? Hank shrugged. Nothing in life is free. Economic times are tough. Every little bit helps. He tucked the bills into his pocket and shot her another grimy smile. Amanda just frowned and slipped her phone and wallet back into her jacket pockets and turned, walking right past Jake and out of the bar back towards her bike. Now. Yes. She turned to look at him, the door to Grizzly's swinging shut at his back. He pulled his keys out of his pocket. What happens if Cal hasn't seen this guy? Amanda shook her head. Then we find him some other way, Jake. That's what being a fucking detective is. Jake frowned. You're still pissed at me. Amanda climbed onto her bike. Yes. Fine. He went to the driver's side of the Jeep. Amanda frowned right back at him. That's it. He pulled open the car door. Yes, fine. I'm not going to try to make you not mad at me, Amanda. Be mad if you want. We still have to solve this case together. Amanda put on her helmet and shook her head. That is the biggest dose of bullshit I've ever heard. I'll see you at Benson's. She gunned her bike before he could answer so that, even if he did, she didn't have to listen to it. Then she peeled out of the parking lot before he'd even gotten the Jeep turned on. Fuck him if he wanted to follow her, he could use the GPS or just get lost. Be mad if you want. He made it sound like she was just mad at him because she wanted to be. What gaslighting crap. She was mad at him because he was an asshole and she refused to let him act that way without consequences. The consequence was that she was mad at him and she wasn't going to let him off the hook just because he tried to tell her that her anger was unfounded. He seemed just as stupid as every other man she'd ever been involved with. Apparently that kind of behavior was universal across any species or supernatural creature. Jake dickhead indeed. But she couldn't quite let it go that easily. She wanted to, but she couldn't help wondering what made someone that mean-spirited, that cold-hearted. She'd wondered before what was up with Jake, what had happened in his past to make him who he was, but now she was absolutely sure that something terrible had happened to him. He was punishing the whole world for it now and would for the rest of his life. Although she wanted to hate him and treat him just as meanly in return, Amanda was not so vicious. Instead, she found herself trying to find sympathy, trying to understand, wanting to know the details so that maybe she could help fix. But that was the cardinal rule of romance, wasn't it? You can't fix people. And she couldn't even quite believe she was still thinking about Jake. And romance, a thing he clearly didn't do. There was still a half an hour till old Cal would open Benson's, so Amanda sat on the curb in the parking lot to wait. When Jake pulled up after her, she expected him to stay in the Jeep like he had at Grizzly's, but to her surprise, he turned it off and ambled over to where she was sitting. He lowered himself down beside her and they sat in silence for a while, which was basically torture for Amanda, but she endured it. Talking to him probably would have been worse. No? I'm sorry I said that shit at the diner. She blinked and looked at him. He was looking back at her, his dark brown eyes intent on her face. Are you serious? He nodded. I don't want it to be a thing, Amanda. I shouldn't have said it. I'm apologizing for it. We're partners. Let's just be partners and solve this case. All right. Amanda wasn't sure what she was feeling. Relief that he apologized and actually seemed to mean it? Disappointment because he just wanted to be partners? Or confusion because she should have just wanted to be partners, but maybe she didn't? Okay, she said because she had to say something. Okay, partners. I want to solve this, Jake went on. And I know you do too. And you're better at this part than I am, I admit that. So I'm not going to touch you again, and we're going to find these fuckers together and there won't be any more fighting. She told him this was what she wanted. She told him not to touch her again until he'd figured out his own feelings, what he was capable of, what he wasn't. And that's what he was doing. He wanted a partner, just a partner, and that was for the best. But Amanda found herself wishing he'd made another choice, a more her-shaped choice. She couldn't try to change his mind, though. She'd asked for it and he'd given it to her, and that was that. She nodded. We'll find them, she said. Then she looked away from him because she needed to lock up her heart and her desire and all the complicated feelings he'd brought into town with him. She needed to remember how comfortable she was being alone, how rarely she'd ever wondered if she might find someone. She was satisfied with her life, with the shape of it. Before Jake, she'd only suffered the occasional bout of loneliness. After Jake, she would endure the same and it would be fine. She blamed herself because he'd never actually given her any indication that he would want something more with her than that. Fuck against her kitchen counter. She rubbed a hand over her face and tried to put it all away. Fortunately, old Cal showed up early, his pickup pulling to a stop right beside her bike. She got to her feet and so did Jake, and old Cal clambered out of his truck with a look of dubious concern on his face as soon as he saw them. Don't imagine you're here for a drink, Amanda, he muttered as he shuffled up to the curb to meet them. No, she said. We got a lead in the Stanley case and we need your help. Cal sighed, but he smiled, and it was not as craggy or grim the way that Hank's had been. Amanda smiled back, tentative, and tried to remember that she loved this town and she was working on this case for Prowler's Bluff, not for Jake. Cal tilted his head. Whatcha got? She handed him her phone with the picture. We're trying to find this guy. Cal nudda. Tom. Yes. Amanda perked up. Tom Glenwood. Jake arrived by her elbow. He was banned from Grizzly's. Hank said he comes here to play the poker machines. Right you are, Cal said. He shows up every few years or so for the off-season, comes in here since Hank kicked him out. Hank said he was rowdy, Amanda added. Sure. But the boys here don't stand for that. Amanda, you know it. He picked a fight once and they kicked him out, didn't even have to throw my hat in. Now, he behaves. Has he been here this season? Cal smilat. Yes, ma'am. Just this week, too. His smile faded. You're telling me this guy is the murderer? Amanda shook her head. I'm not telling you anything, and you know that. Can't. I'm telling you he's a person of interest and we want to talk to him. Cal tucked his hands into his pockets. Well, he wasn't in yesterday or the day before. But he was in last week. Best I can do is call you if he turns up. That's not good enough. She looked up at Jake. His expression was stony. When does he usually come in, if he does? Afternoon crowd, Cal said. All right. Thanks, Cal. We'll be here later. Cal fronat. Amanda. Amanda rolled her eyes. Stop. We'll be subtle. Everyone in town knows you're cops, Amanda. Yes, and I have a drink here all the time. She stared at him. What are you saying? Cal gestured between the two of them. You need to not look like you're cops. On a stakeout is what I'm saying. We'll be cops on a date then, Jake said. Amanda stared at Jake. What? He shrugged. It's a good cover. We'll go back to the station, I'll ask you. Out in front of everyone, and then nobody who sees us here later will think. It's weird. I hate this plan, she said. It's a good plan, Cal said, and he smiled again. See you kids later. He shuffled past them and towards the bar doors, and Amanda was left standing. They're basically hip-deep and awkward. It's just acting, Jake said, once Cal was inside the bar. It's fine. Won't do anything different from normal. The whole town will think we're dating, Amanda cried. So what? When I leave they'll think we've broken up. He was frowning. This is how we break the case. Isn't that the most important thing? Isn't that what you told me? We have to do the work. Shut up. I'll see you at the station. She walked over to her bike without looking at him again because she didn't want to see the smug expression she was sure was on his face.